Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Maybe just someone can do a thumbs up to say you can hear me. Yep, perfect, thank you. So I'm a lawyer at Holding Redlich. Looking at some of the names in the chat, I think I've dealt with quite a lot of you previously. So I do sort of pretty much anything with a development spin on it in Sydney, but a lot of that is Stratum and Strata and community title and all those types of things. So today I thought, just going off the back of Rob Monteath's presentation about a month ago, which I understand sort of touched on Stratum schemes from a surveying perspective, I thought I would give the lawyer's perspective. So I'm going to talk through Stratum and Strata. Oh, hang on. There we go. Stratum and Strata. So one of the things that comes up quite a bit is staging developments. And in my mind, this is the time when quite often it becomes a bit of a discussion about which route you go for a Stratum scheme or do a stage strata. So I want to talk through sort of a scenario that can arise and some of the pros and cons you should consider when trying to advise the best way to stage a development. I'm then going to talk through the role of the BMS and the SMS, easements in a Stratum scheme, the role of the strata development contract if you were to do stage strata, and covenants that exist in stage strata. And then I just want to finalise with just reading some common DA consent conditions. I have a bit of a bugbear here. I think council's consent conditions are usually horribly drafted. So I've got a couple of examples of that and just some tips on how to interpret them. So next one. So staging developments, I find this comes up quite a lot, especially as development margins are becoming lower and lower for developers. Quite often there is the incentive to get the cash in the door as soon as possible, and that quite often means staging a development from a titling perspective. So a common scenario might arise where you've got part of the building which is capable of being measured and part of the building which is not. But you've got a financier and you've got high interest rates and there's a commercial imperative to get part of the development registered and so money in the door whilst they wait for the final part to be constructed. So this is the type of scenario you'll have where you will have to make a decision about Stratum and stage strata. So in that scenario, if you were to do a Stratum plan, you would register a 2-lot subdivision. So you would register the first lot being the lot that it's basically done and you're capable of registering a strata plan as your lot 1, and then you would register a secondary lot, lot 2 or more lots of the further components of the site that are not yet ready to measure. So you would then register a strata plan for the part that you've got, and then you've got your residue parcel that can then be subdivided at a later date. It's a similar concept with stage strata where if you were to go down this route, you would register a stage strata. So you would register your first lots that are capable of being measured, say hypothetically lots 1 to 21 in the strata plan. And then you would register your development lot, which would comprise the further parcel that needs to be subdivided at a later point. So they both achieve the same outcome in that you have a registered strata which allows your developer client to effectively sell down the stock that is ready and pay off any finance. But from a title perspective, you end up with 2 very different structures depending on what route you go through. So with your stage strata, despite the fact that it's delivered in stages, you end up with effectively 1 tier of governance. So there is 1 owner's corporation, there is 1 strata manager, there is 1 building manager. With a Stratum scheme, even though you've done it in stages, you have what's a very different title structure. So you're going to end up with 2 different strata plans, a building management committee. So you're going to have 2 tiers of governance. You're going to have 2 owners corporations, a building management committee. You can potentially have 3 strata managers and you can potentially have 3 building managers. I think this is going off the back of what Rob spoke about as well, in that you end up with very different title structure depending on the 2 outcomes. So why would you go one route over the other? Well, from my perspective, these are the factors that I would take into account. So a stage strata, you've got lower management costs. So every time you add a tier of governance, you're adding a strata manager, you're adding a new building manager, you're adding a new admin fund, a new capital works fund, a new bank account. There's a bunch of additional costs that will come from having a two-tiered system. So if you were to compare those two scenarios, stage strata will always be cheaper than a stratum scheme. There's also a level of complexity that comes with stratum schemes. You're going to have a strata management statement. Whilst they are becoming more common, a lot of purchasers still don't really understand what a stratum scheme is, and a lot of purchasers' lawyers still don't understand what an SMS is. So it's going to make your product more complex from a title perspective. It's going to make the contracts bigger. It's going to make it a little bit more scarier. Your stage strata, even though it's delivered in stages, it's still an owner's corporation. There's still one set of bylaws, and it's relatively simple for the average person to understand. With mixed uses, I think a huge plus for a stratum scheme is that you can put mixed uses in different schemes. So the key reason why I think you should deliver stratum developments is to separate uses. As a general rule, residential does not get along well with retail or commercial. And so if you're going to have a building which has different uses in play, I would always tend to go with a stratum scheme over a mixed use strata. From a perspective in terms of holding assets, a commercial lot in a stratum scheme, whether it's a commercial lot or a commercial lot in a standalone commercial strata scheme, is always going to be more valuable than a commercial strata in a mixed use scheme. Banks don't tend to like mixed use schemes. They think that there's a lot of risk there because you've got to rely on effectively a residential owners corporation to approve any fit out works or to approve development consents or signage or anything that comes with those types of things. So if you've got different uses, I would always lean towards putting it in a stratum scheme anyway, but that's a factor you can consider. In a strata scheme, you're also heavily legislated. So you've got the Strata Scheme Management Act that sets out in a lot of detail what things need to happen in a scheme. So how you work out your admin fund, how you work out your capital works fund. You've got legislation even that talks about meetings, what constitutes a quorum, how you have an adjourned meeting. It goes on and on and on. With a stratum scheme, and we'll go through the sorts of things that are legislated, but there's not a lot. There's a lot of flexibility when you come to doing these types of schemes. And that's another reason why if you do have mixed use, it tends to lean itself to a stratum scheme. Because, for example, if you have a hotel where you've got a hotel operator like a core who's quite hands-on about what type of things they want to be managed, that's not going to lend itself to a strata scheme where you're heavily legislated and you don't get a lot of opportunity to put mechanisms into how things are going to be dealt with. The last point that I take into account is shared costs. I know Rob went into this a little bit, but I'm going to give my perspective on it. And the flexibility that you get in relation to shared costs that you get in a stratum scheme that you don't get in strata. So if you have a look at this scenario, this is a pretty common ground floor plane for a strata scheme. And you've got lots 180 and 179, which are your retail lots. And if you have a look, they've got ground floor access. So they've got street access. I think they're both cafes in practice. And you've got then a whole bunch of common properties facilities. So you've got a common property lobby. You've got common property lifts that go up to all the apartments plus some recreational areas. You've also got lifts that go down to the basement where there's car parking. These two particular lots don't have any car parking. So they're just free front access to their lot and they don't use any other facilities in the scheme. If you look at the Management Act in relation to cost contributions, if this was a strata scheme, those lots have to levy costs based on their share of their unit entitlements. So it doesn't matter that these lots don't use very much of the recreational area, they don't use the lobby, they don't use the lifts, they don't use the basement. They would have to be proportionality to their unit entitlements, pay that for their costs in terms of levies for the admin fund and the capital works fund. You compare that to a stratum scheme, and you've now and then got a very different way of apportioning costs. So rather than do everything on a unit entitlement basis, under the Strata Scheme Development Act, you just need to apportion costs in a fair and equitable manner. So here's an example of a shared facility register. And you'll see what they do is they apportion the costs for each shared facility amongst the different lots. And then usually at the end, there is a method of allocation or a method of apportionment, which sets out the reason why things were apportioned in that manner. So if you have a look here, you can do an apportionment based on estimated usage or assessed benefit. So you do, with the Stratum scheme, get a lot more flexibility in terms of what you make shared. So in Strata, common property will always be shared. Unless you do an exclusive use bylaw, it will always be shared amongst everybody. But with a Stratum scheme, you can pick the facilities that are truly shared, and then you can actually apportion costs on a fair basis, taking into account a number of different factors, which I think for your residential/retail scenario, quite often it is fairer to do a share accostement under the shared facility register. So yeah, two roads, I think, when you're trying to think about staging developments, but they're the types of things that I would take into account when looking at whether or not I was to proceed on a stratum scheme or a stage strata. I think if you've got, as I said, different mixed uses, I would definitely put them in a stratum scheme. If you've got a smaller strata scheme, say 100 units, I think if the only reason you're looking at doing a stratum is to stage it, then that would be a reason why you would just do stage strata, because having a BMS or an SMS with 100 units in a relatively simple development, it's probably a bit of an overkill. So it really is a development by development decision you have to make, and you have to properly talk your client through the pros and cons of the different structures in terms of what it looks like at the end, because both achieve the aim of staging. So just go now to management statements. So what is an SMS? So a SMS is effectively a strata management statement. So this is registered on the first strata plan in a stratum development. So I've got an example there. This is from Central Park in Sydney, but you'll see there we've got 12 lots, and some lots have been subdivided by a strata plan. So the member for those lots is an owners corporation, and some lots are not subdivided by a stratum plan. So they're just a stratum that is held in private ownership. And in those instances, the member is the owner of those lots. So together, those members are all bound under a management statement, which is a statement which is registered. It sits on the title. It is effectively a legally binding contract, which is binding on each member and the occupier of each of the lots. A building management statement is effectively the same thing. It's just exists when there's no strata element. So if you would have a scenario where you had 4 lots that none of them were subdivided by a owners corporation, then you would register a building management statement. So comparing statements, so a building management statement is effectively an SMS, but it does not include a strata scheme. So it's there to regulate stratum lot owners as distinct from owners corporations. The key difference between the two is a building management statement is optional. There's no legislative requirement to register them, whereas a strata management statement is mandatory. So as soon as you register a strata plan in a stratum scheme, then you must have an SMS. The building management statement is regulated by the Conveyancing Act, and the strata management statement is regulated by the Strata Scheme Development Act. Practically, when would you register a BMS? You would only really ever need to register a BMS if you had different lot owners. So if I own 3 stratum lots in a building, quite frankly, I don't need a statement to regulate how I deal with me. Trust me, I'm pretty good. So I wouldn't need a building management statement. But the moment that I was to sell part of the lot to a new lot owner, all of a sudden I'm sharing facilities with someone else and you need a legal contract to regulate how we deal with those facilities and how we own it. So quite often you'll see a lot of buildings that are stratum subdivided with no BMS, but there'll be a BMS in the drawer. And then once the lot owner wants to dispose of one of the assets, they will register the BMS. So you do have flexibility there. It doesn't have to get registered with the Stratum scheme. You can register it with a request form later on. But you would register it before you sold down any assets in the scheme. SMS in some ways is easier in that it must be registered when you lodge your first strata plan. And they're effectively the same document. So if you take apart from the fact that they're regulated under different acts and they come into existence in different scenarios, they're effectively the same thing. They are a contract that regulates how members in the scheme interact with each other. Their intention is to effectively identify shared facilities and to set about how those shared facilities will be repaired and maintained. It'll also set out how costs are going to be apportioned between different members for those shared facilities. And then there'll be a process for decision making and also dispute resolution. And unfortunately, a lot of these things you need very good dispute resolution provisions because you put a whole bunch of different owners in sharing a facility, there's going to be disputes. Now, you might remember I said before that it's relatively vanilla or sparse as to what needs to be included in SMS. It's all set out in Schedule 4 of the Strata Scheme Development Act. But if you were to have a look at that act, it really only deals with about 6 items that must be included. So an SMS must establish for a building management committee. It must set out the functions of that committee and the way in which the statement can be amended. It must have a process for dispute resolution. It must set out shared facilities and a fair allocation of those costs. It must come up with a review process for a 5-year review of the shared facilities. And that's about it. It does contemplate other matters that you might want to think about if you were going to draft one of these things, but there's a provision that says that it doesn't limit the matters that must be included in the strata management statement. So this is sort of an area where there is a huge level of flexibility as to what you can include. And that's, again, why it works quite well with more bespoke buildings, because you do get flexibility to effectively draft and tailor an SMS depending on the asset class you have and the people you've got in the building. An SMS is taken to include a couple of provisions. So if you have a really badly drafted SMS that doesn't say anything about meetings or quorums, there are some implied provisions. But to be fair, I don't think quite often the implied provisions count very much. Most good SMSs or even semi-good SMSs will set out a mechanism for how often a committee will meet, how decisions are made, the quorum and those types of things. If you have a registered BMS and you then decide to register an SMS, you can effectively make an application to the Register General to waive the requirement for registration of an SMS, and that will mean that the BMS will be taken to be the SMS. Historically speaking, the Register General pretty much always agrees to this. If your BMS is fulsome enough and covers the things set out in Schedule 4, I've never had an issue getting a dispensation to registering an SMS under this section. So effectively, if you have a building where you've got a BMS in place and you go to register a strata plan, there's no need to do a whole new SMS, provided it matches the general requirements for a SMS. So easements. So I deal a lot with surveyors, and my favourite saying is you don't need an easement, it'll be a shared facility. I've heard this a bit. Now I think I have a poll here. See, I've never done polls before, so we'll see how this goes. So who's heard this phrase before? Okay. Oh, worked pretty well. Oh, we're still got voting. Okay. So about 50-50, slightly more yes than no. Okay, share result. So 55 said yes, 45 said no. So I hate this phrase. I think it's a myth. And I want to talk through sort of a scenario. Might be a little bit far-fetched, but this is a bit of an illustration as to why my personal view is you need easements even if things are going to be shared facilities. So you might have a scenario where we've got a building. It's got 2 residential strata schemes, a commercial strata scheme, and a hotel. So one of the more complex buildings, but not unusual for a building around Sydney. The 2 residential strata schemes and the hotel share the use of a luxury pool. The SMS provides that a shared facility can be changed with a special resolution, and the residential schemes are sick of the hotel guests using the pool, and they call a meeting. What could go wrong? So if it's a shared facility and the hotel operator can only use the pool because it's a shared facility, then there's a number of things that could go wrong in this scenario. The residential scheme could deal with the commercial and get a vote in their favour to effectively remove the hotel from using the facility. The hotel owner could not show up, and there could be a quorum reached without the hotel operator being there. And the hotel operator may not have paid its levies. So it's a common provision in an SMS that only financial members can vote. So if you forget to pay your levies and there's a vote, you're actually not allowed to vote on a motion. So that would make the hotel operator really sad because the shared facility could be taken away from it and it would have no legal right of access to use a pool that's relatively essential to the operations. But if there was an easement, then the hotel scheme retains access. So if there was a vote and the pool was removed as a shared facility, but the hotel operator had an easement, then the effect of that would mean they can still use it. They just don't have to pay for it. The other things is rights that are regulated under an easement rather than the SMSs as a facility. So the hotel operator would be really, really happy in that scenario. So I admit that's a far-fetched scenario, but the thing with these stratum schemes when you see them in operations is members are never going to get along, especially when you've got things like hotels with residential. They are always going to have disputes. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that members will go off and get lawyers to go through SMSs and conduct scenarios where they can effectively cause a vote or cause a facility to be removed or cause access to be removed under the SMS. So my view is that key facilities need to have an easement. So you need to think about easements for access. Every lot should have a legal right of access to its lot that's covered by an easement. And that includes a legal right of access to any car spaces, to a grease arrestor, to anything that is of fundamental importance to its lot. It should have a legal right of access to an easement. It should also have an easement to access and use key facilities. So, for example, a loading dock or key recreational areas such as a pool, it should have a legal right through an easement to do that. It should have whole of lot easements, so easements for support and shelter, easements for emergency egress, easements for services, easements for use of a shared facility. They're pretty standard for SMSs, and you should have those in a stratum scheme. I should say as well, council usually regulates that by saying that's a DA condition. You've got to have those. And every lot should have an easement for waste storage and collection. So if you've got a lot that needs council to drive over another lot to pick up its garbage, that lot should have a right of easement, and council probably will separately want a right of easement. But you need to ensure that with the easements that if you take away the SMS, fundamental rights are preserved for all the lots, because you just never know what's going to happen in terms of voting. And even if the SMS provides that, for example, you need a unanimous resolution to change a facility, it only takes a member not turning up and you can still get a unanimous resolution, or it only takes a member to not pay their levies and not be financial, and you can still get a unanimous resolution that way as well. So it's that, in my view, that's why you do need easements with these types of developments, notwithstanding the fact that having it as a shared facility does mean they get some access rights there as well. So now turn to the Strata development contract. So the Strata development contract comes about and is registered when you have a stage strata scheme. So if you have a scenario where you have, sorry, my screen's just there. If you have a scenario where you've got your stage strata, then you will register a strata development contract. And a strata development contract is a little bit like an SMS. It sits on the title, but rather than being a contract that effectively regulates how the owners deal with each other, it is a contract where the developer discloses what they're going to do with the development, and the lot owners effectively give the developer rights to allow it to get on and do its development. So it's registered with the first stage. It needs to be in the approved form. You can tell I've recycled some slides because I've got LPI there instead of LRS, but it's an approved form that goes in through the LRS. So some key terminology. Good to note these ones down because I think there'll be a question on it later. But you've got warranted development. So warranted development is any proposed development that the developer of a development lot warrants it will be carried out and may be compelled to carry out. We'll talk about this one in a minute, but effectively, if you do something as warranted development, the developer promises it's going to do it. This is distinct to authorised proposals. So an authorised proposal is development that the developer wants to carry out and wants to be authorised to carry out, but doesn't want to promise it will do it. And permitted development refers to effectively both warranted development and authorised proposals. And an owner's corporation or a person in the scheme has to effectively allow a developer to do any permitted development. So if a scheme says, for example, as part of the development contract, either developer want to be authorised to create additional common property, this would be a permitted development. And if the developer took a strata plan to the owner's corporation, which would create additional common property, then the owner's corporation would need to consent to that plan because it's dealt with in the strata development contract. On registration of stage strata, there are a number of implied covenants. So these covenants are set out in the Strata Scheme Development Act, I think Schedule 3, memory. And the covenants come into existence and bind the developer, any owner of a lot, the owner's corporation, any lessor, and any registered mortgagee. So one of those implied covenants is warranted development. So the developer agrees that the developer must carry out any warranted development that is set out in the Strata Development Contract. So it is a warranty under the Development Act. So I think I've got another poll question. So let me launch this poll. Launch. Okay. So you have our beautiful poll from before, our beautiful pool. Developer wants to put this in one of the future stages. Would you make this a warranted development or an authorised proposal? So you're a developer about to launch or register your first stage strata, and you're planning to put the pool in, say, stage 3. Would you make it an authorised proposal or warranted development? Poll. So we've got about 42% for warranted development and 58% for authorised proposal. So if it was me, I would make it an authorised proposal. So developers are pretty bad at knowing what they want to do. They always have wonderful visions for greatness. They always think there's going to be a pool. They always think there's going to be wonderful rec areas and beautiful trees hanging off the windows. The reality is quite often different. And I think if you're a development lawyer, you would want to make everything authorised and nothing warranted. So you'd want to say, we want the right to do everything. We don't want to warrant anything. Now, there's obviously a tension there. If you've got a purchaser solicitor, they're going to want to see everything is warranted and nothing is authorised, because they're going to want comfort that their purchasers are buying into a dream and that dream will be delivered, and they'll want the developer to covenant and warrant that dream. So I think most of us sit on the developer side fence though. And so for most of us, if we're advising our clients on a strata development contract, the recommendation has to be that as much as possible, everything's got to be authorised proposals, and really you don't want to warrant anything in the contract unless there's a real imperative to give a warranty. You would set pretty much everything as authorised proposals. So what needs to be included in a strata development contract? So you need to set out what's warranted and what's authorised proposals. You don't have to have something warranted. So a lot of my strata development contract says nothing's warranted. And here is the 10-page list of everything we want to be authorised to do. You need to set out the parts of common property that the developer requires rights over whilst undertaking the stage development. This can be quite generic. You can say, for example, we might want rights of access over common property. We might want the right to have scaffolding over common property or to close down parts of common property. You don't have to be specific because quite often you don't know the answer, but you do have to set out just vaguely what types of rights you might want over common property. You need to provide a time frame for completion of the development, and this can be no longer than 10 years from registration. This is a bit of a trap, I find. I think I've seen a lot of strata development contracts that the developer has run out of time. And when you look at those development contracts, the developer's given themselves 2 or 3 years to complete it, which is just crazy because they could have given themselves 10. So my pretty much standard response on a strata development contract is to do 10 years because you never know what's going to happen. Developments can be delayed. Developments might need to be refinanced. You can have builders go insolvent, which is a common thing that's happening. Suppliers not be able to get in. To limit yourself and to have all the powers of a development contract fall away because you hit the date wrong, it is really quite a silly thing to do. So my recommendation is always to go for the full 10 years, unless you've got a developer that's super confident that they think they can do less, or unless from a sales perspective, they can't justify marketing that to purchasers. But I do a lot of off-the-plan sales. I've never seen a purchaser look at a strata development contract and go, why have you asked for 10 years? So if it was me, I would always put the maximum. You've also got to include a concept plan which complies with Section 77 of the Strata Scheme Development Act. And that's quite often, in my experience, prepared by you guys. So I don't do that. The strata development contract needs to be signed by the developer, every registered mortgagee, and the relevant planning authority. So again, with the strata development contract, you need to provide yourself with enough time to get council to consent to that. The Registrar General may also require written consents from any caveator or judgment creditor. Breach of the strata development contract. So if a developer breaches it, then action can be taken by any owner of the lot or the body corporate. There can be damages for breach of covenants. So again, if you've made something warranted development and you don't do it, you as a developer can be on the hook for damages. You can also be on the hook from the secretary, which is fair trading, who can administer fines. Just a random case, but there is very few cases on stage strata, but this case was one that came out in 2007. where effectively an owners corporation tried to submit that because the DA was referred to in a strata development contract, that because the developer breached the development consent, they breached the strata development contract. The court didn't agree with that. So to have a breach of a strata development contract, it's got to be an actual specific breach. Just because you refer to something in the strata development contract and there's an auxiliary breach won't actually give rise to a breach of the strata development contract. Amending it once it's registered. Once you've registered a strata development contract, it's pretty difficult to amend it. So you're going to need approval from the owners corporation, from council, from mortgagees, chargees, and lessee of any development lot. So the only bonus you get is that an owners corporation can approve it during the initial period. There are also issues with amending the time frame for completion of a development. So going back to the 10-year rule, if you allow a development contract to lapse, you then can't retrospectively go and amend that date. LRS won't accept the registration. So if you allow a development contract to lapse, varying it's no longer an option. You have to go to the Land Environment Court to either get an extension of the development period or to register or direct LRS to register the variation. So when will stage strata be considered to have concluded? It'll conclude once the planning approval required to undertake the scheme is revoked. Admittedly, that's pretty rare. The strata plan of subdivision is registered in respect to the last development lot. That's the usual trigger. So once you've registered your final strata plan of subdivision, the whole scheme will fall away. The conclusion time for the development arises. So that's the time you put in your strata development contract. So if you put 2 years, that's when it'll expire 2 years later unless you've varied it. Unless you register a notice in the approved form saying the scheme is concluded or if the scheme is terminated. The problem with stage strata is that once it concludes, the strata development still sits on the common property title search. So it's actually really difficult. If you're a purchaser and you do a common property title search, you'll have a strata development contract that you'll have to review. And really, it's a bit hard to work out sometimes whether or not there's anything left to do or whether it's all done, because there's no real notation on title unless a notice in the approved form is lodged. So it's something that will sit there forever. So the development contract will always be a disclosure document for sales purposes, but after the period of time has is concluded, or after the developer has actually done the development, even though it sits on title, it really has no work to do left. Okay, so I want to talk through some development consent conditions. This is sort of my bugbear with councils. So sort of back to basics on covenants. There are two different types of covenants. So you've got a negative covenant, which is your restriction on use. It must be negative in substance, and it will usually restrict the commission of certain actions. So an example is the owner of the burden lot must not construct a structure over the side of this covenant. So it says must not. This is distinct from a positive covenant, which is positive in substance. So a positive covenant might say, for example, that you have to do something in a positive act, or you have to pay or expend some money. So an example is the owner of the burden lot must, at its cost, maintain the stormwater detention system constructed on the lot. Is a common one. Nearly always, if you have a development consent condition, it will require the local authority to be the party benefited by the covenant, though in theory you can have a negative covenant that benefits another lot. You can only ever have a positive covenant that benefits a statutory authority. Okay, so here's an example of a consent condition I've seen. So prior to the issue of the subdivision certificates, all lots created by this consent shall include, I blocked it out, but a requirement that no plumbing may be installed on the lot burdened unless it has provision for recycled non-potable water service. So I've got another poll here. So let me go back to my polls. So do we think that this should be a restriction on use or a positive covenant? No plumbing may be installed on the lot burdened unless it has provision for recycled water service plumbing and facilities in accordance with Ballina Shire Council's dual water supply plumbing policy. Another 10 seconds. Okay. So 76% think that it should be a restriction on use. I agree with you, but council has positive covenant. So the reason why this should be a restriction on use is negative in nature. So no plumbing may be installed on the burden lot unless it has provision for recycled water service. So it's not saying you have to go and install the water serving service. It's saying you can't install plumbing unless it complies. But Ballina Council had it as a positive covenant. So this is one of those scenarios where what council wants in terms of how they've labelled it and what the actual condition is a mismatch. So I've got another one. Okay. So another one, prior to issue of the subdivision certificate, in accordance with section 88B, something is to be placed in the titles of the residential lots stating all windows, external doors and other openings and any proposed dwelling located in the lot's burden must incorporate effective screening. Where the dwelling includes larger openings, blah, 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 blah. So do we think this is a positive covenant or a restriction on use? Sorry, that's the last one. So let's do another poll. So do we think this should be a restriction on use or positive covenant? Ten seconds. Okay, so the vast majority of you said positive covenant. I tend to agree with you. I think this one's a bit harder, but I think it's positive covenant. Again, though, in this particular council, they went restriction on use. The reason why I think it's positive is it's saying there's a positive obligation for all windows and external doors to incorporate effective screening. I think if they were to make it a restriction on use, then you would need to say, sort of similar to the previous one, that no dwelling can be constructed on the premises unless the windows and external doors and any openings had the effective insect screening. But it's ambiguous. And you'll see this comes up time and time again with consent conditions. So you have ones where sometimes in the same paragraph they're inconsistent. So here's an example where you've got a requirement for a public positive covenant, but then later in the sentence it says the restriction shall have the effect of restricting any type of fencing. So again, if it's a restriction, that's negative. If it's a positive covenant, it's positive. And then you have consent conditions that really shouldn't be a consent condition at all. So if you have a look at this one, you've got green waste bins are to be managed by a contractor responsible for green waste disposal. It's lovely. It doesn't really do anything. It's not requiring really a positive obligation on lot owners. It's not really requiring a negative restriction on lot owners. I'm finding more and more with consent conditions that council are tending to use covenants as a way of telling purchasers things that they really want purchasers to know. So a common one that is coming up, especially in more rural councils, is a requirement to have a covenant where the purchasers are advised as to what the rating for soil salinity is. Really shouldn't be a covenant. It's a notification piece, but a lot of councils are putting it in their consent conditions, and we then have to deal with it in trying to come up with something that makes council happy but also legally works. So when it comes to consent conditions with these sort of larger developments, I think my lesson is you've really got to read them carefully. I think just because council labels it a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that is how you've got to deal with it. If it says positive covenant, I think you've either got to look to see whether it is a positive covenant, and you shouldn't be scared to change it to a restriction on use. I've never had a council have a complaint if you change their consent conditions, as long as you explain why you've done it. I think the risk with not doing it is if you submit to LRS and 88B, that even though councils are signed off on, if you're creating covenants that aren't really covenants, you will, if you get the right examiner, get a requisition. Similarly, if you create something under the guise of a positive covenant, but it's clearly negative in context, you will get a requisition from LRS. And if you're getting requisitions sort of that late in the piece when you're under examination after council's given the subdivision certificate, it's a hell of a lot harder to change it than if you raise it at the point you get into the subdivision certificate. So my moral of this long-winded speech is, if you can and you're involved early enough in the development, encourage your client to give you a copy of draft consent conditions if they get it, and you can fix it up earlier. If you don't get that opportunity, review anything required in the consent conditions carefully. Try and make use of what you get, and if you need to redraft things, feel free to redraft it. And then when you submit it to council for its subdivision certificate, if you've made substantial deviations, I usually just submit a letter, covering letter explaining why I've taken the approach I have. But that was my presentation. I think we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. So happy to discuss any questions or anything anyone's got, whether it's on Stratum, Strata. Oh, I've got one question. Why would you change from restriction to covenant and vice versa? Covenant. Do you mean, Jara, maybe if you want to jump on and just, do you mean why would you want to change?
Why would you want to change that? So you're going over the DA and you go, well, I think that's more of a restriction, or I think that's more of a positive covenant. I think we can change that. Is there any benefit in changing that?
Yeah, the benefit is that if you don't change it, so say you have something that council once called a restriction on use and it's clearly positive, if you create it as a positive covenant and then you lodge it with LRS, if you get a more senior examiner who knows what they're doing, they will requisition you and refuse to register the 88B, because even though you've called it a positive covenant, it's clearly a negative covenant. So if it gets raised at that point, you're going to have to go back to council and get their consent to amend the 88B, at which point that's looking at about a 2-week delay to your development. Whereas if you raise it up front with council and draft the 88B correctly, then you're taking away that requisition risk.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it's more a timing thing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I guess if we want to be pedantic, it's just bad drafting on council's perspective. But I guess the reason why we care is that you don't want it erased at the 11th hour. And look, I have had LRS requisitions for trying to create negative covenants as positive and vice versa. I do think, like anything with LRS, it is a matter of who you get down there. But I just don't see the point in taking the risk. I think if we're preparing the 88B, the onus is on us, whether it's us, the lawyer, or the surveyor, to make sure that what we're creating, if we're calling it negative, it is actually negative, or if we're calling it positive, it is actually positive.
Cool, thanks.
SDG, some councils are reluctant to move from the wording of the approved DA. Is the council legally bound by the wording in a condition? Some councils are reluctant, though, and maybe because lawyer adds some stout, I'm not sure, but my general experience is that if you provide a letter to say that what they've got is completely wrong, they do change from their condition. But is council legally bound by the wording in their condition? DAs have to, all conditions of a DA have to be legally possible of being enforced. So if they've asked for something that you can't create, I don't know how they can stick to it, to be honest. I'm not sure if that answers the question, because some councils are more stubborn than others. But I think the problem you've got still is that if you stick to council's wording and you lodge it with LRS, if LRS reject it because it's not capable of being able to lodge it, then you've got a catch-22, because you've got one statutory authority who's refusing to register it, and you have another statutory authority that's requiring it to be worded a certain way. So I think that's the problem. I'm not sure if that answered your question, Najib. I think if you've got a lawyer, and if you've got a stubborn council and you've got a lawyer involved in the project, I'd be getting the lawyer on their letterhead to write a letter to council saying that their condition is not legally correct and it should be changed. That's how I would deal with it practically.
Hey, Elly, I think we have another question from David in the chat.
Have you ever had council ever ask for a 4.55 for a change or a restriction to a positive covenant? No, I haven't. I usually just I've never seen them request a 4.55. Normally they'll just accept it as a variation they can accept as part of approving the subdivision certificate. That said, though, if you do get a chance to review draft DA conditions, it is better to address them as part of that stage, so you don't have an issue where they're different. But I know most clients run off and get DAs without us being involved, so I can understand there's an issue there. Carl, you suggested a lot should have specific access to cover critical essential easements. Can these be global, or do they need to be defined? Best, I'm assuming you mean, do they need to be whole of lot easements, or do they need to be delineated on the plan? As much as possible, they should be delineated. If there's an issue with how we do that, then you can do a whole of lot easement and define it in the terms. But generally speaking, if it's, for example, an access easement, the best course of action would be to clearly delineate where that access is.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions that they'd like to ask Elly? Either write them in the chat or pop your hand up. Okay, well, thank you, Elly, for your time today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We will most likely share the recording with you, but if you have any further questions, just send them through to the IS email and I can pass them on to Elly.